Welcome to This Day in His Story, created by American Heritage Worldwide. A reminder that every day holds something new to learn. Did you know that as a child, Johann Sebastian Bach got in trouble for copying a forbidden musical manuscript on the roof by moonlight? Learn that when his parents died, Bach was raised by his older brother, a church organist, who helped further his musical and educational schooling. Discover how Bach struggled with poor eyesight and became completely blind before he died. Learn that Bach was known as a musical storyteller because he based his work on sacred themes and Bible stories, believing that music should glorify God and uplift the soul.
If you were to travel back in time to March 26, 1685, and ask a town musician named Johann Ambrosius Bach how old his newborn son was.
He'd probably proudly tell you the boy was 5 days old.
Right. But if you look at the history books today, that same child hadn't even been born yet.
It's a completely bizarre paradox.
It really is. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at this giant stack of historical notes and biographical excerpts about a name that, well, literally everyone knows.
But very few actually understand Johann Sebastian Bach.
Exactly. Our mission today is to figure out how this guy became the undisputed master of the Baroque era, even though his work was basically dismissed by the people he lived with.
Yeah, completely unappreciated in his own time.
And to start, we have to talk about that weird timeline-bending fact about his birth. So he was born in Eisenach, Germany on March 21st, 1685. But that was under the Julian calendar.
Right, which was what his specific region was using at the time. But astronomers had already figured out that the Julian calendar was kind of broken. It miscalculated the solar year by about 11 days.
So by the time Bach actually dies in 1750, most of Europe is jumping over to the Gregorian calendar, which is way more accurate.
Yeah, and when historians later went back and applied that new calendar to his life, his birth date physically moved. It shifted from March 21st to March 31st.
Which means if you ask a historian which date is correct, the answer is both.
And honestly, that paradox is the perfect way to look at Bach. I mean, he's a guy who straddles different eras and totally different musical philosophies.
We look back at him today as this absolute titan, right? Like a fundamental pillar of classical music who influenced Mozart, Beethoven, Mendelssohn.
Oh, absolutely. But his actual lived reality was so far removed from that pristine, powder wig image that we always project onto him. His life story is really just a masterclass in brutal resilience.
Totally. So if you're listening right now, whether you have season tickets to the symphony or you're just insanely curious about historical rule breakers, this deep dive is going to completely change how you hear a symphony.
Because the man behind all those notes was just fiercely uncompromising.
Yeah, and to get why, we have to look at his early life, because it reads like a really depressing Dickens novel. He was born into this massive family of working-class town musicians.
Right. His dad taught him the violin, so he got this very tactile, hands-on foundation in music from basically the moment he could walk.
And he started school super early, right? Like age 7?
Yeah, age 7. And it wasn't easy stuff. We're talking intense religious instruction, Latin, German literature. He was absorbing this really complex theology that ended up defining everything he wrote later.
But then just absolute devastation. By the time he's 10, both of his parents pass away.
Yeah, entirely orphaned as a little kid.
It's awful. So he gets sent to live with his older brother, Johann Christoph, who is this church organist in Ohrdruf.
And his brother is a great musician, and he pushes Doc's education forward, but he's also incredibly strict.
Super rigid. There's this one specific story in the sources that I think highlights their dynamic perfectly.
The Moonlight manuscript story.
Yes. So young Bach is tearing through his organ and harpsichord studies, but he wants more. And his brother has this collection of forbidden, highly complex musical manuscripts locked away in a cabinet.
And Bach, being Bach, sneaks out at night, pulls the manuscript out through the lattice of the cabinet, and secretly copies it.
By moonlight.
Literally by moonlight, for 6 months. And when his brother finally catches him, he just confiscates the copy and punishes the kid.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. It's like a modern kid getting grounded for staying up late reading comic books under the covers with a flashlight.
Right.
Except Bach was doing it with insanely complex sheet music.
And think about the sheer mechanical difficulty of what he was doing. He wasn't just reading a novel in the dark. He was visually decoding dense polyphonic sheet music.
Which means what exactly?
Well, polyphony is multiple independent lines of music moving at the exact same time. So he's copying that by hand, using only the moon for light. You have to hold massive, complex harmonic structures in your head to do that.
Wow. So it's less like sneaking a comic book, and more like a young programmer reverse engineering a complex operating system by reading raw code in the dark.
That is the perfect analogy. And this early deprivation, losing his parents, combined with his brother kind of gatekeeping this advanced knowledge, it forged this unstoppable, almost obsessive drive in him.
He wasn't just practicing to get a good grade.
No, not at all. He was ravenous to understand the architecture of sound.
Yeah.
He was literally willing to ruin his eyesight just to see how the gears of a composition fit together.
And that obsessive drive doesn't go away. By the spring of 1700, he's a teenager, and he decides he needs to go to a specific school in Lüneburg to advance his education.
Right, and they didn't exactly have an Uber for that.
No. He doesn't take a carriage. He and a friend travel 180 miles across Germany, mostly on foot.
It's wild. They'd hitch occasional rides on farmers' carts or, river barges, but mostly just walking across the country.
Just for his education. The physical toll of a 180-mile trek in the year 1700 is just, I can't even imagine.
And the craziest part is, he originally got into that school in Lüneburg because he had this really beautiful soprano singing voice. He was essentially singing to pay his tuition.
Oh, but then biology happens.
Exactly. Shortly after he gets there, his voice breaks. He completely loses the instrument that was funding his schooling.
I feel like most teenagers would just panic or pack up and walk the 180 miles back home.
Yeah, but Bach was relentlessly adaptable. He immediately pivoted. Since he couldn't sing, he just threw himself entirely into the violin and the harpsichord.
And that's when he meets Korkbone, right?
Yes, this prominent German organist living in Lüneburg. Bohm heavily influenced Bach's keyboard technique. So Bach took this catastrophic biological change and turned it into an opportunity to master the keyboard.
Which is amazing. But this extreme childhood dedication, you'd expect it to produce this very compliant, well-behaved adult.
Oh, not even close.
Right. The sources show the exact opposite. That stubbornness evolved into this fiery, rebellious streak that got him into so much trouble with his bosses.
His career was turbulent, to say the least. Like in 1703, he starts as this jack-of-all-trades musician and eventually becomes the teen organist at the new church in Arnstadt.
And he's got all this terrifying technical skill, but zero patience for mediocrity.
Zero. He constantly clashed with church officials. They were actually scolding him because he was playing variations during the hymns that were too complex.
He was confusing the congregation.
Yeah, too many notes, too many weird harmonies.
Wait, and here is where it gets really interesting. Because we picture classical composers as these dignified, holy figures. But the sources say he straight up ghosted his employers for months.
Oh, the vacation gone wrong. Yeah. He asked for a few weeks off to travel and hear this famous organist play. And he just decided to stretch those few weeks into months.
He just didn't go back. He left him in the dark, lost his standing at the school, and had to go work for royalty. How do we reconcile this holy composer with the guy who pulls a stunt like that?
Well, and it gets worse. He literally went to prison for trying to switch jobs.
Wait, prison? Really?
Yes. So in the 18th century, musicians under the aristocratic patronage system weren't freelancers. They were liveried servants. They were essentially the property of the court.
Oh, wow. So you couldn't just put in your 2 weeks' notice.
Exactly. So in 1717, Bach is working for Duke Johann Ernst in Weimar. And he gets this amazing offer to become the Kapellmeister, the director of music for Prince Leopold of Anhalt-Köthen.
Which is a huge promotion, so he tries to take it, but the Duke says no.
The Duke refuses his resignation, but Bach, being insanely stubborn, just continuously and aggressively demanded his release.
I'm guessing the Duke didn't like that.
Not at all. He was so infuriated by the insubordination that he had Bach locked up in jail for nearly a month.
He served time just for the right to manage his own career.
Yeah. He was fiercely protective of his artistic environment. He was willing to sit in a 17th century prison cell because going to Köthen represented a totally different canvas for him.
Because Prince Leopold was a Calvinist.
Yeah, right. And Calvinist church services didn't use complex music, so Bach was suddenly free to write secular instrumental music. As soon as he got out of jail and got to Köthen, he just exploded with creativity.
Writing all those concertos, dance suites, sonatas.
Exactly. He was fighting for a very specific style of music.
Which brings us to the actual music he was willing to go to jail for. What exactly was he doing that caused so much friction? And why did people back then hate it so much?
To see that clearly, you really have to look at his Leipzig years. After Köthen, he takes a job at St. Thomas Church in Leipzig, and the demands were crushing.
Teaching Latin to choir boys, writing brand new church music every single week.
Yeah, this is when he's writing his massive cantatas, the Christmas Oratorio. He's a musical storyteller, but his Baroque style was basically defined by having, quote, lots of notes.
Lots of notes. And the core of that is something
Okay.
called counterpoint, right?
Yes. Counterpoint is everything for Bach. Today, most pop music has one main melody line, like a singer, and then chords underneath it. That's homophony. Counterpoint, or polyphony, is multiple, totally independent melody lines playing at the exact same time.
So imagine counterpoint like a really busy city intersection.
Yeah.
You have multiple cars, bicycles, pedestrians, all weaving through at the same time. They're all on their own paths, but somehow perfectly synchronized so no one crashes.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it. He was writing 4, 5, sometimes 6 independent melodies. Horizontally, they had to make sense on their own, but vertically, when stacked on top of each other, they had to follow strict mathematical rules of harmony.
If one person steps into the intersection at the wrong time, the whole thing crashes.
Exactly. It requires a staggering amount of human processing power to compose. But ironically, that complexity is exactly why his peers couldn't stand it.
That's the biggest shocker of this whole deep dive for me. He wrote over 1,000 works, and the people of his time thought they were just old-fashioned.
Yeah, most weren't even published while he was alive.
Why? I mean, it sounds brilliant.
Because Europe was shifting. The heavy mathematical Baroque style was out. People wanted the new galant style lighter, simpler, elegant, driven by one clear melody, the precursor to Mozart.
Ah.
So Bach is building these towering, intricate cathedrals of sound, and the critics are basically telling him he's pedantic and has too many notes.
They looked at him like a dinosaur.
Pretty much. Though it's funny, he was actually so technically gifted with the physical nature of sound that he had a lucrative side hustle.
Oh, the organ repair.
Yes. People regularly hired him to inspect and repair organs. He understood the literal machinery, the bellows, the pipes, the wind pressure, better than the guys who built them.
He approached it like an engineer.
Totally. He was building sonic architecture, and he was completely indifferent to the pop culture trends of the 1730s and 40s.
But that raises a big question. If he wasn't doing it for fame or wealth or the approval of his peers, what was driving him? Writing 1,000+ masterpieces doesn't just happen by accident.
No, it doesn't. And to understand his drive, you have to look at the intersection of his unimaginable personal grief and his absolute religious devotion.
The tragedy he endured was just staggering. In 1706, he married his cousin, Maria Barbara. They had 7 kids. But then in 1720, while he was away traveling, she suddenly got sick and died.
And because travel was so slow back then, he didn't even know. He walked through his front door weeks later and found out she had already been buried.
That's heartbreaking. He did marry again later, a gifted singer named Anna Magdalena, and they had 13 more kids.
Bringing the total to 20. But the sources highlight this brutal statistical reality of the era. More than half of those children died.
Only 9 survived to adulthood, so he had to bury 11 of his own children.
That level of compounding grief would break almost anyone. But for Bach, his music was both his coping mechanism and his religious duty. They were the same thing.
So it wasn't strictly just a job for him.
Oh, not at all. By 1727, he's writing his Passions, like the Passion according to St. Matthew, this monumental work telling the crucifixion story. He was taking his own profound understanding of suffering and putting it into his art.
And he'd literally write INJ on his sheet music, right? In nomine Jesu, in the name of Jesus.
Yeah. There's a quote in the sources where he says the aim of all music should be, quote, the glory of God and the refreshment of the soul. And if it's not that, it's just diabolical bawling and twanging.
Diabolical bawling, I love that.
Huh?
But refreshment of the soul, what does that actually mean for him practically? Was he just trying to cheer himself up?
It's deeper than that. The sources actually point to an excerpt from a pamphlet called For the Strength of Youth. It talks about how music profoundly affects the mind, spirit, and behavior, and how it can draw you closer to the divine.
Oh, so it's a spiritual conduit.
Exactly. Bach lived that at an atomic level. His music was a direct channel to process his grief. When the critics called him out of touch, he didn't care because he wasn't writing for them. He was writing to survive his life and commune with God.
And he kept doing that right up until the very end.
Even when his body started failing him. By the 1740s, his eyesight is going probably from a lifetime of copying manuscripts by candlelight.
But he refuses to stop. In 1747, he's playing for King Frederick the Great. And then in 1749, staring down his own mortality, he starts his ultimate piece, The Art of Fugue.
which is the absolute pinnacle of counterpoint. A fugue is like a musical puzzle. You have one theme, and then a second voice comes in with it, then a third, overlapping upside down backwards.
Exploring every mathematical permutation of one theme.
Right. But he never finished it. He was so desperate to save his vision that he let a traveling British oculist do eye surgery on him.
And it was completely botched.
Totally botched. It left him completely blind. He suffered a stroke shortly after and died in Leipzig in 1750.
Believing his life's work would just fade into obscurity.
Yeah. His manuscripts were divided up, tucked in drawers. Some were even sold for scrap paper. The world just moved on to the classical era.
But you can't bury architecture that sound forever.
No, you can't. Nearly 80 years later, this brilliant young composer, Felix Mendelssohn, finds a copy of The Passion, according to St. Matthew, and Mendelssohn immediately sees the terrifying genius in it.
So in 1829, he organizes this massive public performance of it in Berlin.
And it was an absolute sensation.
Wait, why did the public suddenly love it 80 years later when they hated it in the 1730s?
Because the cultural pendulum had swung back. Europe was entering the Romantic era, which valued heavy, monumental, deeply emotional art. The world had finally grown up enough to understand what Bach was doing.
That's incredible.
That 1829 performance sparked the Bach revival. It resurrected his legacy. Plus, several of his surviving sons became massively successful composers too, so they literally carried his musical DNA forward.
It's the ultimate historical vindication. The greatest genius of the Baroque era spends his life writing 1,000 perfect masterpieces, endures prison and tragedy, only to be dismissed as old-fashioned.
And then completely proven right a century later.
It really leaves you with something heavy to think about. I mean,
Yes.
What incredible world-altering brilliance exists in our world right now that we are completely dismissing as out of touch, just waiting for someone to rediscover it 80 years from now?
That is a great question.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. The next time you have a free moment, seek out Bach's Little Fugue or the St. Matthew Passion. Listen for those interlocking gears, the rebellious spirit, and the unyielding faith of a man who literally wrote his way through the dark. Keep questioning, keep digging, and we will catch you on the next one.
Thank you for joining us for this day in his story. May the lessons of yesterday inspire you to see God's hand today and to play your part in his story now. For more faith-based learning, visit ahsworldwide.org, the homeschool for faith and family.